One of the great things about literature is that there are no right or wrong interpretations. We all have different backgrounds, different experiences, different ways of looking at the world. And so it's only natural that when we read literature, we're going to see it differently. And that's a good thing. In fact, the more perspectives that we get, the more ways that we have of looking at a piece of literature, the more enriching the experience becomes. But even though there are no right or wrong interpretations of literature, there are right and wrong interpretations. Or I should say, there are strong and weak interpretations. For example, if you feel that a character is feeling alienated and alone, but you cannot provide any explanation or any evidence to back up your opinion, you don't know why you believe that, you don't know where that thought came from, it just kind of popped into your head. You can't point to any specific passages from the text to back you up. You don't know why you believe it, and you cannot explain it or convince anybody else of this opinion, then it's not a very strong opinion. It's not a good opinion or interpretation, I should say. On the other hand, if you can say, okay, I have an opinion, I have an interpretation that the character's behavior is because the character is feeling alienated and alone, and I can point to specific actions or descriptions on the page, I can look at dialogue or thoughts the character's having, and I can take the textual evidence, take the stuff from the story, and I can make a case for my opinion, then I've provided a much stronger and more effective interpretation. And that's the goal, that's the value of this class. We want you to practice reading stories, reading plays and poems, reading works of literature, thinking about them, forming opinions, and then as you go, you're going to learn to express those opinions, and you're going to talk about them, discuss them, and even write about them. And so we want to do a better job of interpreting literature. And so what can help us with that are these lists of critical approaches on the screen here. There are, we call these literary schools or critical approaches, and each one of these approaches on the list, each type of criticism is a type of lens, a type of window, a different way of looking at a work of literature. And by utilizing one of these forms of criticism, or maybe using a variety of them, we can go beyond just giving personal reactions to personal opinions. I believe something, I don't know, that's just my personal opinion. But if we then use one of these critical approaches, then we're more likely to come out with a very strong, organized interpretation. So as we work on our literary analysis, I'd like to encourage you to try to see literature through different lenses. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through briefly and explain each of these critical approaches, each of these different types of lenses. And then we're going to look at the story Counterparts by James Joyce. And once you see how you can apply the schools of criticism to that work of literature, you should be able to understand the value of really how literature matters. These critical approaches will help you see this story in many different ways. Okay, I'd like to start with new criticism. I think it's really important. It's probably the most important one, I think, for this class, is because I want you to really emphasize the process of what the book here calls close reading. Sometimes in a literature class, people kind of disregard or disrespect the literature itself. We love to talk about personal issues. We love to talk about our personal lives. We love to talk about social issues, what's going on in the world. But when I ever try to get around to, hey, why don't we just talk about what's actually written on the page, you can kind of hear sometimes crickets chirping and nobody's saying anything. So we don't want to disrespect or disregard the literature. We want to take it seriously. We want to get into the lines there on the page. Read very carefully and look at those elements of the story or the poem or the play. So your book here talks about looking at the poem's internal structure, images, symbols, metaphor, point of view, plot, characterization. Look at the literary language, the connotation or denotation of the language, ambiguity, irony, paradox, repetition of ideas. So here, how a poem means is inseparable from what it means. The way it put together, really take a look at the structure of the poem or the play or the story. And the primary method of judging the worth of a piece of literature is organic unity. or the complex way that all the elements of a text contribute to the overall meaning. Okay, so the really emphasis here is on the close reading and on textual evidence. Back up everything that you believe about the story with evidence from the text. So I can't emphasize enough how important new criticism is. Okay, now moving on, feminist criticism really is talking about gender roles, and we can expand feminist criticism to talk about gender criticism or gender studies. The way that society identifies or defines gender roles, and how do people feel when they are either challenging those roles, they don't fit quite into those roles, how does that affect the individual characters? So a feminist critic might try to uncover and challenge essentialist attitudes that hold that it is normal for women to be kept in domestic, secondary, and subservient roles. And they also affirm the value of a woman's experiences and perspectives in understanding the world. So when you read a story, take a look at the female characters and how are they portrayed, what are their roles, how are they depicted, how does that affect them? But we can expand that beyond just the women, the female characters, and we can look at male characters as well. And we can look at the ways that culture socializes us to act in certain ways because of our gender. So, for example, I might think, what does society think it means to be a man? And somebody might have a particular feeling about what it means to be a man, and they might feel like a lot of stress trying to fit into that definition. So we can expand feminist criticism, and we can call it gender criticism, and dealing with gender beyond just the roles and experiences of women. Psychoanalytic criticism, I think, is a lot of fun, especially for literature. It's very fun to kind of pick at the brain of a character. And the idea there is that whatever you see on the surface, what's going on the surface of somebody's mind and their thoughts and their ideas are simply glimpses or symbols about something that is really going on deep down beneath the surface. So the psychoanalytic criticism kind of looks at literature as a kind of dream. And this dream has all kinds of little clues or symbolic elements that are masking what's really going on deep down under the surface. So we can really psychoanalyze characters in literature to find out what's going on. So that's a pretty fun, interesting approach to the story. Now, Marxist criticism is not looking so much at the psychology of the individual, but looking at sort of social structures and how do these social structures affect the individual characters. So there's an idea that there's a false consciousness about history and material well-being, and that this false consciousness prevents workers from seeing their values have been socially constructed to keep them in their place. So there's sort of like a society that's kind of rigged, a structure of society that kind of keeps the person, the poor working class person at the bottom, and they're not aware of the fact that they are trapped in these social structures. And so the process of reading literature for Marxism becomes a way to unmask our limited view of society structures. Okay, so we'll look at Marxist criticism later. And next is deconstruction. Deconstruction kind of, along with new criticism, really looks carefully at the language of a story, but it has a primarily the idea that language is not something neutral, not clear, direct communication, but it's something that is infused with bias, assumptions, and values. Language filters and distorts and alters our perception. And so we really get around and see how we play around with the game of language, about how language is fuzzy or slippery or ambiguous. And so one way to deconstruct a text is to show that the oppositions in the text are not really absolutely opposed. So there might be these sort of oppositions like rich and poor, or old and young, or male and female. And they're set up as opposites, but a deconstructionist will look at these and break them down and show that they're not really as opposite as they seem to be at first, okay? So that's deconstruction. Reader response criticism really takes the approach that, different than new criticism, that the meaning of a text is not something embedded or buried in the text. It's not, texts do not come pre-made with meaning already built into them. We don't just dig down and dig up the meaning like buried treasure. We're not searching for or trying to discover the meaning that the author put into the text beforehand. The idea is that the text is kind of meaningless until the reader starts to read it, until it's opened. Once the reader engages and interacts with the text, then the meaning is created at that moment. And then, for example, when I read something as a child, I'll interact with the text and it will have a certain meaning. And I might come back to that same story later as an adult, and I'll interact with the text in a different way, and the story will have a different meaning for me. So the text does not come alive and does not have any meaning until the reader engages with the text. And so the text is not an object, but it's an event that occurs in readers over time. So this really kind of challenges the central idea of new criticism, which is that the meaning is internally built into a text. And so I like this idea here where it says that the great thing about reader response theory is that our reading reveals what is inside of us more than what is inside the text. So reading literature becomes a form of self-discovery. We kind of learn more about what does it mean to be human. We learn more about ourselves as we read. We find what we expect to see. So what's great about this is that we can see that reading becomes very personally relevant, personally significant. Okay. Post-colonial criticism is very interesting because what we're looking at here is what happens again when there's a dominant culture. There's a kind of a dominant norm within a society. And when somebody is outside of that dominant culture, they're outside of that norm, they're portrayed as being inferior or less than. They feel like they are the other. It's an important term for post-colonial criticism is the other. I'm not part of the dominant culture. I'm not part of the norm. And so I feel other or less than. And the character develops a double consciousness that leads to feelings of alienation and deep conflicts. And so an important term to use for post-colonial criticism is unhomed. When somebody feels like they don't belong, they don't fit in, they don't belong, they don't feel like they have a home. If they're unhomed, that's the feeling that somebody gets when they are the other. And so post-colonial originally was looking at sort of colonial 19th century European politics, but we can really apply that beyond colonies or traditional colonialism to any situation in which there's a dominant culture, a dominant norm, and seeing what happens when figures, individual characters are outside of that norm. All right. New historicism takes a look at history and challenges the old view of history as sort of like history is a bunch of facts and you're trying to learn about what happened in the past. The emphasis here in new historicism is that history is a collection of narratives, a collection of stories or discourses. And we have a collection of these small micro narratives, and reading literature is a way of interpreting a vast web of interconnected discourses and forces in order to understand an era. So literature really plays a great role in the understanding of history, because what we have in literature is a collection of discourses, or in a story we might have many characters interacting and we have different discourses going on within the same work of literature. And so the new historical critic is looking for power struggles among these discourses. Okay. Now, queer theory is very similar in that it's looking at a society that has a dominant culture or a norm. And then what happens when somebody is feeling they're outside of that norm, they feel like they are the other or less than. And instead of using the word other, they might use the word queer, queer being beyond the norm. Now, with queer theory, it's primarily focused on sexual identity. When you have the dominant heterosexual culture, and then what happens when there are individuals that are outside of this norm. So it's similar to this post-colonial criticism, in the sense that there's a dominant or norm, but it's taking more of a sexual identity slant on the same concept. But again, we can expand the word queer beyond sexual identity, and it says that the queer becomes whatever is at odds with the norm, the accepted and the dominant. Okay. Object-oriented criticism. Now, these last types of criticism is like, how do you understand what's going on? How do we understand or interpret the behavior or actions of a character? Well, one way might be able to look at values, or is to look at how objects are treated in the story. Look at the production, consumption, and exchange of material things. Another name for this is thing theory, which is hard to say, thing theory. But look at the objects like clothes, furniture, money, cars, weapons, sports equipment, jewelry, and so forth. And we can learn a lot about the values or the way the society works, or about characters, by the way that they interact with or handle these objects. So it says here that an object-focused approach might study how characters lust for luxuries instead of just aiming to satisfy basic needs. All right. So again, we're going to look at these, and by looking at all the objects, we can try to understand some things about the characters. We could also look at what is called the cognitive criticism, which is looking at the theory of mind. What are the mental processes through which we cope with the world? So we can look at a character and we can analyze this character in terms of their thoughts or their theory of mind. And then we also have our own, as readers, we have our own theory of mind when we're analyzing characters. As your textbook says here, we try to identify features of the story world that we face. So again, when we try to apply this to counterparts, we're going to see how the theory of mind or the cognitive criticism can really start to understand more about the characters, but also more about ourselves as well. Now, related to cognitive criticism, which looks at thoughts or ways of thinking about the world, we can look at affective criticism, which is focusing on emotions or feelings rather than kind of thoughts. The feeling that, what is the feeling that this literary work expresses, depicts, or provokes? And we use emotions as clues to values, beliefs, and wishes. So we look at a character, we look at their emotions, and then try to figure out what are the source of these emotions? What do these emotions tell us about what's going on with this character? All right. So it's, again, these kind of link to psychoanalysis, where we're really trying to dig out and figure out what's going on, what makes a character tick. We can also look at performance-oriented criticism. The idea where characters are like going through pretending to be something they're not, or putting on a show, bragging, or trying to play a particular role and not being authentic. We present ourselves as certain types of people through the actions that we repeat. So we can try to analyze a character by looking at their actions. So you see, we had cognitive, affective, and performance-oriented criticism is we're looking at their thoughts and their feelings and their actions. And then finally, rhetorical criticism, we look at their words, their speech acts. And we look at the way that they talk, and are the characters speaking in terms to trying to persuade? Examples include promising, requesting, demanding, apologizing, firing, warning, bragging. And so we look at speech acts. Okay, that's called rhetorical criticism. Now, we can put these together. If we group them together like this on the screen, I'm going to say, let's make it easier to just say, instead of this big long list, let's just pick 3 groups: structural, social, and psychological, or social/sexual. Now, in structural criticism, we're looking at just the work of art, the work of literature, and trying to understand, what does the literature mean? New criticism looks at the internal structure, the components of the story, to find out what it means, how it's put together. Deconstruction, okay, looking at the language and how it's structured. And then reader response is talking about the interaction between the reader and the work of literature, and the meaning is created there. But all of these are talking about looking at the story, understanding how the elements of the story are working together, and what does the story mean. So I'll put those into a group, just call it structural criticism. Now, social criticism is looking at kind of the social structures and how these social norms or structures affect the individual. So remember, whether it's Marxist criticism, New Historicism, PostColonial Criticism, and gender studies. Well, we can talk about feminist and queer theory, or we could put them together and call it gender criticism, right? But what's going on in that second group? Again, it's all about there being a norm or a dominant culture, and then individuals that are not fitting into that structure, and what is the relationship between the individual and the society. So instead of using all these specific words, you can say, I could look at the text itself and the meaning of the story, structural. I can look at social structures and individuals at social. And then finally, I can look at literature and try to understand what is going on inside a character, what's going on inside their mind, or what's going on inside the mind. And so we can look at psychoanalytic criticism, cognitive, affective, rhetorical, performance-oriented, and object-oriented. We can look at all those forms, and we can use the objects, their actions, their words, their feelings, their thoughts, and symbols to understand what's going on in the text, in the character, I mean to say. So we've got the structural, social, or social sexual, and then the psychological. These are three broad windows or lenses through which to look at the literature. So now once you get a general idea of this, let's see if we can go now and look at the story counterparts and try to look at it from different perspectives, okay? All right, so when we get to the front of counterparts, I'm going to go through and show you what I've highlighted, and then I'll just so that we have this to come back to when we look at the actual critical approaches. All right. So when I read a story, look, I notice the way that this character, Farrington, the main character, is described, right? It says that he had great bulk, hanging face, dark wine colored. His eyes bulged, dirty. And I noticed a repetition of heavy step. He went heavily upstairs, puffing with labor and vexation. So you start feeling about like there's a guy and somebody's yelling, Mr. Allen wants you upstairs. See right here. So right away, we have a furious voice calling out in a North Ireland accent. Mr. Allen wants you upstairs. So right now we already know that Farrington seems to be in some type of trouble, right? That he's being yelled at and he has to then go upstairs. And I want you to emphasize this because I noticed a repetition of upstairs versus downstairs, the upper versus the lower. And I start to see it repeated, I start to think that it might become important. Okay. So Farrington, the main character, has to get upstairs, and he seems to be a man who has great bulk, dark, eyes bulged, dirty, heavy step. And so I'm getting a kind of a picture of this character. But then his boss, Mr. Allen, has a shrill voice. And in contrast, and so this might be my first counterpart, in contrast to Farrington, Mr. Allen is a little man with gold-rimmed glasses and a clean-shaven face. So I get a very stark contrast between the man Farrington and his boss, Mr. Allen. And it says his head itself was so pink and hairless that it seemed like a large egg reposing on the papers. Now, when I see this, I don't really think of it as an egg. I kind of think of it as like, pardon my language, but it seemed like he's a dickhead. I think that this character Farrington really thinks of him as a little prick. And so even his description of this pink and hairless, bald little man with a shrill little voice, we automatically, before we even read much into the story, we get a very stark contrast between these two men. Okay. So again, we continue with that contrast in section 15. It says he stared fixedly at the polished skull. So we've got this big, shiny, bald head of his boss. And he works for a company here called Crosby and Allen. So we know that Allen is one of the main bosses of the work, Crosby and Allen. And he looks at how fragile. See, so that's the interesting thing here is that this boss seems like a tiny, little, fragile, shrill, weak little man. And yet he has the authority and the power at this office. And Farrington, who seems like he's very strong and big, seems like he has no power at the office. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie, The Incredibles, the animated movie Incredibles, but every time I read this story, I think about that, where this giant superhero, Mr. Incredible, is being chewed out by some small little fragile bald man screaming at him and stuff. And eventually he just wants to grab his throat and throw him against the wall. And I can't help but thinking of that for this, because we've got this contrast of the small, shrill, weak, fragile man being in charge of the strong man. And so that seems ironic. It seems like it's the opposite of what I would expect. And notice it says here, a spasm of rage gripped his throat. And this comes, I see a repetition throughout the story of how angry this Farrington is. It's constant repetition of violence and rage. So he wants to, you can see he wants to reach out and just throw the guy against the wall, just like in the movie The Incredibles. And he says, the man recognized the sensation and felt that he must have a good night's drinking. So as this rage, anger spills up, he keeps wanting to go to the pub and just drink and kind of get away from this kind of stress, I guess. Right? So after he gets kind of chewed out, he says, now go downstairs and do your work. So it's interesting that the boss is upstairs and the employee is downstairs. To me, that's another reinforcement of the upper class guy versus the lower class guy. He has to go up to the boss and then back down to his work. And notice again, it repeats, the man walked heavily and he returned to his desk at the lower office. And then he sat there and continued to stare stupidly. So you get the idea that he's sitting at this office job and he probably absolutely hates his job. He's a big, strong dude. He seems like he should be out on a ship somewhere or on farming, building something. And he seems like he's out of place, trapped in this little office. Just like, again, on The Incredibles, a superhero should be out there fighting crime, not wearing a shirt and a tie, and sitting in a little cubicle inside with artificial lighting. So you get the sense that he just sits there and hates his job, and he's just kind of stalling and waiting for the clock to pass. So what he does then is he slips out to go get himself a little drink, right? And again, it says he was now safe in the dark snug of O'Neill's shop, inflamed face, the color of dark wine or dark meat. That's the second time that it talked about his inflamed face being the color of dark wine. Again, that's talking about him being sort of angry or in rage. Okay. So he steps out to have this drink, and then he comes back in, and then we have an introduction to a new character. He smells this perfume, and this kind of fancy woman, Miss Delacour, comes into the office. And then as we notice, it says here that another little clue, it says 5 times in one day is a little bit much, whatever. And so we find out that throughout his day working, he's kind of slipped out 5 different times, I guess, to go have a drink or get away from his job. So he's supposed to be getting these paperwork done, and he's stepped out of work 5 different times. So it says here, the dark, damp night was coming, and he longed to spend it in the bars, drinking with his friends, amid the glare of gas and clatter of glasses. So it's sort of like a thank God it's Friday kind of thing, right? He goes through, works Monday through Friday, hates his job, and he wants to live for the weekends. Well, he can't wait till 5 o'clock comes. He wants to get the heck out of his office and go have some drinks with his friends. So he comes up to, he has to bring this paperwork, but because he spent so much time goofing off and skipping out to go have a drink, that he realizes he's not going to get his work done. So he brings his paperwork up, and it's missing some important information. So notice it says that he bowed respectfully to Mr. Allen and Miss Delacour, but they took no notice of his bow. So again, it's a very demeaning or belittling situation where they feel like they're very important people. Mr. Allen is with his client, and he's a low-life nobody that they don't even pay attention to. So what does he do? He bows to them. They don't even pay attention to him. Then it says again, he returned to his lower office. So he goes back to his place at the bottom. And notice that it makes him angry. It looks like he wants to scream. He says he wants to basically slam his fist down on something violent. And he's completely enraged. It says he felt strong enough to clear out the whole office single-handedly. He basically just wants to go and beat up everybody. And it says his body ached to do something, to rush out and revel in violence. All the indignities of his life enraged him. So you're wondering, no, what's going on? Why is he so angry? It says here that it's the indignity of life, constantly feeling disrespected or put down. He wants to feel important or respected, and he's not feeling that way, and it's making him angry. So it comes right out and says that the indignities of his life enraged him. I love this line. It says, the barometer of his emotional nature was set for a spell of riot. He's just basically ready to blow his top at any moment and beat somebody up. Well, then Mr. Allen finds out that these pages are missing. And so he's there with the customer, right? So he's got this customer here, Miss Delacour, and he's missing these pages. And all of a sudden, Mr. Allen starts to look. It says he began a tirade of abuse, saying that the 2 letters were missing. It was so bitter and violent that the man could hardly restrain his fist from descending upon the head of the mannequin before him. So as he's getting, so again, I keep thinking of Incredibles, as he's getting chewed out, the guy's little boss, Mr. Allen, is screaming at him, and he just wants to reach out and punch him. And then I think this part cracks me up here at number 35, where right in front of the co-workers and the customer, the boss says, "Do you take me for a fool? Do you think me an utter fool? Like, do you think I'm an idiot?" And now, of course, you're supposed to say no, right? So he says, the man glanced from the lady's face to the little egg-shaped head and back again. And almost before he was aware of it, his tongue had found a felicitous moment. "I don't think, sir," he said, "that that's a fair question to put to me. Like, I don't think it's fair for you to ask me if you think me a fool, because I obviously can't tell you the truth. I can't answer honestly and say, yes, I do think you're a fool." So again, instead of saying no, he says, "I don't think that's a fair question to put to me." So I think that's hilarious. And Miss Delacour smiles, and all the co-workers probably giggling. So that just makes Mr. Allen even more pissed off. So it says, Mr. Allen flushed to the hue of a wild rose, and his mouth twitched with a dwarf's passion. He shook his fist in the man's face till it seemed to vibrate like the knob of some electric machine. You impertinent ruffian, I'll make short work of you. Wait till you see, you'll apologize to me for your impertinence, or you'll quit the office, right? So you better apologize or you're going to be fired. Now, we don't really get to see it here, but obviously Farrington apologizes. It says here, right after number 40, that he had been obliged to offer an abject apology. And then, of course, that's just going to add to that sense of anger, having to kind of like swallow his pride and apologize. It says he felt savage and thirsty and revengeful, annoyed with himself and with everyone else. He made a proper fool of himself this time. Could he not keep his tongue in his cheek? But he points out that they never got along, and we get a sense of why Mr. Allen kind of hates Farrington so much, is that at one point, Mr. Farrington was imitating his boss. He was taking on his taking on his North Ireland accent and making fun of it. And Higgins and the secretary, Miss Parker, are all laughing. And then Mr. Allen comes in, and so he did not like Farrington. Now, this becomes an important detail later, that we find out that Mr. Allen is from Northern Ireland, right? He's from like a British part of Ireland, whereas Farrington is in Dublin. He's in the southern part of Ireland. And so now we're going to talk about that post-colonialism again, where Mr. Allen is sort of like the British North Irish person with a different accent. And he's in charge over Farrington, who's from the south of Ireland. So at this point, he just wants to get away. Now, it might be tempting to say that the source of this guy's anger is his drinking. He's an alcoholic. He's constantly drinking. But I'm not sure we can say that the alcoholism or the drinking is the cause of his anger. It might probably more of a symptom than a cause. It seems like he's trying to drink to kind of forget or get away from his problems. He just wants to get to the pub. Pub is short for public house. He wants to get to a pub, be with his friends, and just party. He just wants the music and drinking and talking, and he wants to get away from this crappy job. Okay, so that's the first major scene, is that his job. Okay, now we go into the second main part of the book, the story, which are his sort of like bar hopping. He goes to these different bars with his buddies, having all kinds of drinks. Now, notice again, when we talk about different types of critical approaches, we talked about performance-oriented criticism, on the concept of performance, or rhetoric-oriented criticism, the type of words, the speech acts, and so forth, right? So notice that as he's going to the bar, he's practicing. He wants to tell his friends about what just happened with his boss. But notice that he kind of tells the story in a way that makes him look good. He kind of exaggerates or brags about it. So he's practicing how he's going to say it. So I look at him coolly, and looked at her. Then I look back at him, taking my time, I don't think that's a fair question to put to me, says I. So he's trying to act like he was all cool, and he just kind of played it out perfectly. But as we saw from the original story, and the part of the story that he kind of said that without really thinking about it. It just kind of came out, right? But he's going to make himself look as cool as possible. So he sees his friend there, Nosy Flynn, and they're in a pub called Davy Burns. And he tells Nosy Flynn all about what happened to him at the office. And Nosy Flynn thinks it's so great. He thinks it's kind of the smartest thing as he's ever heard. Then two other guys come in. O'Halloran and Patty Leonard come in. And so they tell the story again. And they all crack up about how funny it was. And they go, "Oh, man, Farrington, you're awesome. Boy, you sure showed Mr. Allen." Now, notice that Farrington is leaving out the part where he had to go and apologize to save his job. He had to tuck his legs between his legs and go in there and apologize. But he's leaving that part out of the story. So then his friend Higgins comes from. And I remember Higgins works at the office. So Higgins comes in and they go, "Hey, let's hear your version of the story." And so Higgins goes through the whole story again. And they all start laughing. So he feels like he's kind of a hero there. All the friends are kind of talking and laughing and then going, oh, wow, Farrington, you're so great. Well, then we're introduced to another character, though, named Weathers. He's a performer as an acrobat at the Tivoli, right? And it says, notice that their talk became theatrical. I love that line here. Talk became theatrical. They're all sort of like BSing, exaggerating, telling stories. Well, they move on to the next bar, Scotch House, there. And then they had to move on when that closed to Mulligan. So they go to 3 different places here. Remember we said they started out up here. They went to Davy Burns. Then they moved on, dropped a couple friends, moved on to Scotch House, and then they moved on to Mulligan's. Now we see an important scene that parallels what happened with Miss Delacour in the office. 2 young women with big hats come by their table. And Farrington is attracted to one of these women. It says one of the young women was very striking in her appearance. Scarf, peacock blue, yellow gloves. Farrington gazed admiringly at the plump arm. She moved with grace. She answered his gaze. He admired still more her large, dark brown eyes. So he's feeling the chemistry there. He's feeling a connection. She glances by him and she just kind of bumps by him and she says, oh, pardon, in a London accent. So notice that she's British as well, just like Weathers is British. And we talk about Mr. Allen as sort of being British, North Irish. And so she's just she's not doing anything wrong, right? She just walked by, accidentally bumped into him and said, excuse me, I'm sorry. But notice he starts getting really angry. He says he cursed his want of money. See, he had been buying drinks all night, bought everybody drinks, and now he's out of money. He went to the pawn shop and got rid of a watch so that he could get some drinking money. Then he spent it all. And so now he doesn't have, he wanted to like offer to buy this woman a drink, but he can't because he's out of his money. So he cursed his want of money and cursed all the rounds he had stood. Now, to stand around, that means that you're buying the drinks for everybody. Everybody, this round is on me. That's what it meant to stand around, okay? So he's cursing all the rounds that he paid for and all the whiskeys, all the expensive drinks that he gave to Weathers. So he bought Weathers this drink so he could brag and feel like he's a big man. It's like people that do bottle service at a club. They pay all this money for bottle service just so people can look at it and go, oh, wow, look how awesome you are at the club. You're in a special area overpaying for booze. You must be amazing, right? So people just do that bottle service. They get to feel like they're important or something, right? So if there was one thing that he hated, it was a sponge. So he was so angry, he lost count of the conversation. So that's very interesting here that he starts to go into this rage about this woman. Now they start having a discussion about feats of strength. And they look how strong Weathers is. So they start to have like an arm wrestling competition between Weathers and Farrington. And Weathers wins, right? And it says Farrington's dark wine-colored face flushed darker still with anger and humiliation, having been defeated. So they go for it again, and he gets defeated again. And he's just absolutely angry. So here's what I think is one of the most important lines here right after number 55. In your text, you should really mark this or pay attention to this. A very sullen-faced man stood at the corner of O'Connell Bridge. All the locations here are in Dublin. They're real locations in Dublin, the O'Connell Bridge, waiting for the little Sandymount tram to take him home. He was full of smoldering anger and revengefulness. He felt humiliated and discontented. He did not even feel drunk, and he had only 2 pence in his pocket. He cursed everything he had done for himself in the office, pawned his watch, spent all his money, and he had not even gotten drunk. began to feel thirsty again, and he longed to be back again in the hot, reeking public house. He had lost his reputation as a strong man, having been defeated twice by a mere boy. His heart swelled with fury, and when he thought of the woman in the big hat who had brushed against him and said, "Pardon," his fury nearly choked him. So all these things are like indignities. He wants to feel he has a reputation as a strong man. He had lost his reputation as a strong man. That line says so much about what's going on with Farrington. And we can identify with him. Don't automatically think that he's some horrible person. He's a person who wants to feel important. He wants to feel strong. He wants to be respected. And everybody kind of wants that. We don't like being belittled or disrespected or put down. And so that longing for drink or whatever is, what does he really need? What does he want out of life, right? So he gets home, and you think, okay, you got that feeling that people say that a man is the king of the castle, right? Well, I'm going to be a nobody at work. I'm going to be a nobody at the bar. But when I come into home, I'm going to be the king of the castle. I'll be on top. I'll come in there. My wife will be subservient to me. She'll serve me my food. My kids will come up and kiss my feet or whatever. But he shows up and his wife's not even home. She's off at church. And we notice that when he's sober, his wife is pretty much in charge and bullies him. Then he gets drunk and he bullies her. And they've got 5 kids. And the food's not ready. And so he does not even feel respected at home. So at this point, he has to take out on his anger on the only thing that he can, which is his kid. The only kind of thing below him in status is his kid. So poor Tom, he says, "Go get me the dinner." And he says the problem with that is that the fire's not hot enough for the food. And he's all pissed off. How could you let the fire go out? So he hits Tom with this walking stick and beats him. And so it is sad. It's sort of he's abusing his child here. And we don't condone or try to explain away this act of violence. But we can, in a sense, sympathize with him that there's a reason why he's violent. There's something going on. And we can't just look at this one action. We have to kind of understand what's going on. All right. So that's the story counterpart. And what I like about your book is then it goes through all those forms of criticism that we just talked about and applies each one of those to the story to show how we can end up with multiple lenses or multiple perspectives of the same story. So if I'm going to take the new criticism approach to the story, I'm going to look at small things like look at the title, counterparts. How many counterparts do we notice in the story? Well, there's Mr. Allen and Farrington. There's Farrington and his son Tom. There's a counterpart between Farrington and his wife, the bar and the church. We see a parallel about when Weathers beats him in the arm wrestling match at the bar. That parallels the verbal beating that he got from Mr. Allen in the office. And so these contrasts, these counterparts, by looking at that, that's how the unity of the story is put together. And also we end up with what's called irony. We notice the irony that the strong Farrington is beaten by Allen and the strong Farrington is beaten by Weathers. It's the opposite of what we would expect. Okay. Now, a feminist criticism, you might look, first of all, at the female characters like the secretary, Miss Parker, and the customer or client, Miss Delacour, and the women in the bar. And do you look at it negatively or positively? One way of looking at it is the women may be subservient. They're only valuable because they have to dress up and have perfume and fancy dresses, and they have beauty, and they use their sexuality or beauty to have some type of control over the men. Oh, there's also Farrington's wife. Okay, so we have these 4 women: Miss Parker, Miss Delacour, the woman at the bar, and Farrington's wife. And so do we see these women? But beyond feminist criticism, I think it's interesting to look at gender criticism. And I think we can look at our queer theory also. But look at the fact that Farrington has an idea of what it means to be a man. To be a man, you want to be a provider and a protector. And as a provider, notice that he basically pawns off his watch and then spends all of his money in the bar. Instead of coming and providing this money for his family, he drinks it away, trying to impress his friends. Then as a protector, instead of being a protector, he beats up his kid. And he doesn't show respect to his wife or to women. He's a womanizer who kind of sizes up Miss Delacour and the woman in the bar and checks out how pretty she is. And so you can look at a lot of the gender aspects of the story, and it's a very fruitful way to look at the story. You learn a lot about what's going on here by using this lens, okay? So are women considered to be subservient or lower, or do they hold some type of power over the men? And what type of gender role is Farrington trying to fit into, right? Psychoanalysis. This idea that perhaps Farrington has deep-seated wounds from his childhood. Maybe he was abused by his own father, and he was put down as a kid, and because of that, he doesn't feel respected. And so the fantasies at work in Farrington also suggest some type of projection. He's blaming his problems on Mr. Allen and his job. But what we see happening is that all this anger is boiling up at the surface. But what's going on is below the surface, there's some type of buried pain, some type of intense loss of self-esteem, fear of intimacy, and betrayal. There's something going on deep down inside the heart of Farrington, and we need to find out what that is based on the clues or symbols that we see at the surface level. All right. Now, real quickly, Marxist criticism is very important. Remember, I said that there's sort of like this office culture, and that Farrington is sort of at the bottom. He's trapped at the bottom of this economic structure. And there's a hierarchy that keeps him at the bottom, the upstairs, downstairs. He's down at the bottom, and he needs to know his place, and it's driving him crazy. Deconstruction, again, takes those counterparts like male and female, escape and confinement, and these opposites, and tries to explore the opposites and try to show that there are not exactly opposites, right? Reader response criticism, you bring in your own personal experiences. We take a look at our culture with domestic violence and the problems with the responsible versus irresponsible masculinity, the Me Too movement, things that are going on, and we can bring in our own experiences to it. Post-colonial criticism, remember, we can look at it from the Northern Ireland to the British versus the Irish thing, which is that Farrington feels unhomed or displaced. He doesn't feel like he belongs. He feels like the outsider or the other. And that anxiety of feeling like he's inferior and put down all the time is where his anger comes. So we can take a look at that, his agony and exile, and we can look at it from a post-colonial point of view. New criticism, again, we talk about social discourse. Farrington's sarcasm, his drinking, his longing for camaraderie, his resorting to violence. Farrington is defeated at work, he's defeated in the pubs, and he's defeated at home. Because he is unable to move from one discourse to the other. So it's taking a look at the same concepts as the other, but from a slightly different angle. Queer theory, again, looking at as the other. He's sort of humiliated and emasculated. He wants to be the strong man, and he and the more effeminate men are stronger and put him in his place. He feels emasculated, forcing to apologize, and humiliated by the contest with the artist, right? So it says, alert to the inconsistencies, contradictions, and ambiguities of conventional gender behavior, protocols, and values. Queer theorists offer provocative and enriching readings that remind readers how easy it is to oversimplify the bewildering complexities of being men and women. So again, what does it mean to be a real man? He has a concept of, to be a man, he has to be strong, and he feels like he is belittled or humiliated. But maybe Farrington has the wrong idea of what it means to be a man, or what does it mean to be strong. It doesn't automatically have to mean physically strong or powerful. It could be something else, all right? Object-oriented criticism, finally, look at these ways of understanding the character, like the walking stick that he uses. And I think the really interesting one is that he pawns his watch, showing that he values the time with his friends drinking more than he cares about money or time or something. He blows all his watch and he blows the money in order to have the beer with his friends. And so he gives up time, he gives up money in order to have that. So by looking at the way objects are used, you get glimpses into the character. Cognitive criticism, they talk about here the theory of mind. For example, he kind of, sometimes he gets it right, but he sort of expects that this woman is going to come over here and flirt with him or talk to him. And then he doesn't, he's angry. Maybe he has a false assumption about this woman. Okay. So we can look at the metaphors that I showed you about heavy steps, heavy upstairs, heavy, heavy, heavy. Dark, darkness, dark, dark, dark. So this repetition of metaphors can also add to this cognitive criticism. Emotions, again, that's affective criticism. Again, all the stuff about anger and fury, what's going on with his anger. So that's the one that really applies to this story. Performance-oriented criticism. Remember that there are performances, all this bragging. Speech acts coming up later, but performance and speech acts are very closely related. He's trying to play the role of a strong man. Sort of, he's like, it's an act that he's putting on, but it's kind of broken down, right? He yearns to assert his self-image. He's out to prove that despite his setbacks, he's indeed a strong man. So I like that with the performance-oriented criticism. Is he trying to play the role of a strong man, and that is taken from him. And then rhetorical criticism, we're talking about speech acts again, all this bragging and storytelling. Hey, look what I did at the office, and you can gain a lot of insight into that. Okay, so that's the end of this lecture. It's a long one, I know, but hopefully that you can understand now how that these critical lenses can be approached, be adapted or applied to literature in order to interpret it and get more meaning out of it. Okay, so that's the lecture now, and then in the future, the videos will be shorter, but I will be going through the different literature throughout the semester. So be sure to come back, watch the videos. You can watch them in sections. You don't have to do it all at one shot. And that's it. So if you ever have any questions about the literature, please contact me. And again, you can always discuss this with your classmates on the discussion board. All right, I'll see you next time.